introducing the spring lecture series. So this is the event that we have today is part of the Applied Linguistic Lecture Series, where we invite scholars from linguistics, from education, and from other relevant disciplines. We always welcome participants both from Applied Linguistics and from any other department at UMass. And tonight we are particularly thrilled, if we can say that, because we feel already a strong feeling that we are very happy because we have a legend in applied linguistics, and those of us who are in the field have been essentially socialized through her work. And if you want to remain in the loop about what we do in terms of the speakers we invite you to like us on Facebook. And even if you don't like us, if you want to know what we're doing, you should like us, and then you'll see we have more lectures coming up. But this is the inaugural spring lecture, and Professor Etienne is going to introduce our amazing speaker.
Good evening, everyone. This is my honor and my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lightbown, Distinguished Emerita Professor of Applied Linguistics from Concordia University in Montreal. Dr. Lightbown completed her bachelor's in French at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. She then served for the Peace Corps in Niger for 2 years. On her return, she went back to the academia and obtained 2 master's degrees, one in teaching French at Yale University, and a second one in TESOL at Teachers College, Columbia University, where she also pursued her doctoral studies. Along her career, she was a visiting professor in numerous universities, McGill, Penn State, just to name a few. She joined the Applied Linguistics and TESOL Center at Concordia University in Montreal in 1975, and she stayed there until 2001, when, to the surprise of all her colleagues, she chose to retire. So it is indeed a very big challenge to do justice and to capture in a few sentences and a few minutes the work of such a prolific and profound teacher-scholar. Dr. Lightbown has lived through the development of our field, the field of applied linguistics. She has been part of the milestones from the heyday of audiolingualism through the advent of communicative language teaching and the influence of comprehension-based L2 learning, and finally, dual immersion and content-based language teaching. Dr. Lightbown has served the discipline in multiple roles. She has received the most prestigious awards. She has given myriad presentations and workshops. She has published extensively. We all know the purple book, as students call it in the department, entitled How Languages Are Learned. Often it's your first introduction to applied linguistics, but it's also a book one comes back to over and over for its back and forth between theory and practice, its clarity, its numerous examples, its scope, and the multiple questions it leads its readers to ask. But beyond the number of publications, in my opinion, what makes Dr. Lightbown so special, what is at the core of her scholarship, is the time she has spent in many, many language classrooms where she has shared, but also further developed her understanding and expertise in collaboration with language instructors and language learners. In her own words, she defines her research goal, quote, since the late 1970s, my focus has been on understanding the relationship between teaching and learning in classrooms where second languages are taught and sometimes learned. End of quote. Influenced by cognitive psychology research, in her classroom inquiry, Dr. Lightbown has focused on issues that shed light on classroom language learning. Just to name a few: transfer appropriate learning, which refers to matching learning activities to the language uses learners will be exposed to; L1 influence and awareness of L1 influence; the relevance of metalinguistic knowledge, particularly in young learners, and its interface with meaning-focused language use; the role of feedback, of individual variables, fluency development, focus on form instruction; In all her research endeavors lies her determination to bridge the gap between research and practice, bringing research into the classroom, making it accessible and meaningful for teachers. The titles of many of Dr. Lightbown's publications reveal her twofold commitment to research and practice. A case in point is a recent article published in 2019 in the Modern Language Journal that Professor Lightbown entitled, quote, "Perfecting Practice," end of quote. A play on word with the famous saying, "practice makes perfect," but also intentional ambiguity. Is it students' practice activities that need to be perfected, or is it teachers' teaching practices? We find the same concern and symbiosis between theory, research, and classroom teaching and learning captured in another recent article entitled "Teaching and Learning L2 in the Classroom, It's About Time," alluding to the use of time in the classroom, but also urging teachers and researchers to make a difference and to increase the effectiveness of their research. I am thrilled to have the opportunity to listen to Dr. Lightbown's inspiring voice tonight. And I'm so happy that she finds herself, quote, "feeling not completely retired," end of quote. That said, it is my turn to be a little facetious, and I will say, it's about time. Without further ado, let us welcome Dr. Lightbown.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. I repeat that, and thank you to Dr. Etienne and Dr. Gunari for inviting me. Thank you to the doctoral students who've been so interesting. I've had visits with 14 of your doctoral students, from whom I have already learned a great deal. It's been a great pleasure to spend time with you, and I'm sure that as we get to the end of the presentation today and we have more time for questions, I'll learn more as you bring your perspective to the kinds of things we want to talk about. I always find that the question period is the best part of any presentation, and I often tell the story of the days, probably more than 20 years ago now, when artificial intelligence was first allowing us to interact with robots on the telephone. And in those days, in the early days, if you said something, it would interrupt the transmission, so you'd have to start all over again. And I remember vividly the first time I spoke to somebody at American Airlines who said, the robot voice said, "I don't mind if you interrupt me." And I thought, now that is moving forward in the right direction. So whenever I start a presentation, I always want to say, "I don't mind if you interrupt me." Realistically, I understand that if we stopped and answered every question along the way, we would probably not leave here tonight, because I know already that you have many interesting questions and many interesting issues to discuss. But if there's a point where I'm gone off somewhere and you're saying, "Why is she talking about that?" or "I don't understand what she's talking about," maybe interruption would be an appropriate thing. But for sure, we'll leave time for questions at the end. Though, as Dr. Etienne said, I have retired, I have remained engaged and active in the field, and I'm really committed to the field of second language teaching and learning. It's something that gives me great joy and great concern also. I wish that more young people had the opportunity to successfully learn languages. There's simply too much done at the policy level to make it difficult for some people to retain the languages they already speak, never mind for other people to learn new languages. That's a whole issue that we won't talk much about tonight, but it's something that is of great concern to me. Spending time with the graduate students has already renewed my own energy and optimism that there are lights at the end of the tunnels. I will say, and just another little thing to reflect my continuing engagement, that the Purple Book, as you call it, is actually undergoing a further revision. Nina Spada and I are working on it now. She's in Vancouver and I'm on Cape Cod, but we work back and forth pretty well together, and it's a pleasure to work with her again. So we're hoping in 2021 there will be a new edition that will reflect some of the ways that the field continues to change. The previous edition came out in 2013, and we kept saying, don't change what's not broken, don't fix it if it's not broken, but there is so much new material, so we're trying to keep it, we're trying not to make it longer, but we're trying to make it richer, and I hope that it will work for you too. Now, I have a question to ask. You're going to hate me for this, but I'm going to try it anyway. How many of you either are or will soon or have recently taught a foreign or second language in a classroom? Okay, that'll be just about everybody, but not quite everybody. How many of you consider yourselves, now I have to define a little bit here. If I say a proficient speaker of a language, I don't mean somebody who never makes a mistake or who's mistaken always for a native speaker, but somebody who is able to get it done. No reference to the current campaign slogans, but somebody who's able to get things done in a second language, or at least in at least two languages. How many of you would consider yourselves proficient in that sense? You can get it done in at least two languages. There are some who are, I suspect that many of you who are not raising your hands are being modest or reflecting a view of proficiency that is more stringent than it ought to be, but we could have that conversation maybe at a later point in the thing. But of those of you who raised your hands to say, yes, I can do it, how many of you have learned that language, at least to some extent, in a classroom? I think it's pretty much all the same hands. Maybe there are a few exceptions, and if I had been brave, I would have asked you to stand up and sit down, and we would have done that kind of thing, but we'll be short of time if we do that. But the reality is that if you are a proficient user of a language that is not the language you learned from your parents and in your earliest childhood, the likelihood is that you partly learned it in a guided, instructed environment. So what is it that the classroom offers that you don't get if you don't learn at least partly in a classroom? My own path to research and teaching in second and foreign languages started in a very stereotypic American way. I grew up in North Carolina in a very monolingual environment and never heard a word of another language spoken until I went to my high school French class, and it changed my life forever because I started to learn French, and everything that's happened to me in my life since then arose because I learned French in high school in a rural school in North Carolina. So people never know where life will take them, but to be sure, for most of us, language is one of the pivotal realities that has moved us around and changed our lives, whether it's through family changes, through educational changes, through immigration or travel or love affairs. Language shapes how we become who we are. Over the years, I've done lots of different kinds of things, and my work has changed and expanded, but I think the theme that has run through everything I've done has been, as Dr. Etienne suggested, a commitment to and an excitement about helping teachers and learners in classrooms so that what they do there, what they do when they spend their time in the classrooms leads to the outcomes that they're hoping for and gives them joy and satisfaction. I just, I'm terrible about asides and self-interruptions, but I was just struck by something that I recently printed for purposes of posting it in a school where I'm working, and it was a quotation from Maria Montessori, who said something along the lines of the best or a good measure of the success of an education program is the happiness of the children. And I think that, I feel that so strongly, whether it's children or adult learners, it's their feeling of success and satisfaction that something good is happening in the classroom. So we'll all work for happiness. Now, another theme that has run through my research over the years is the issue of time. And I won't focus on that tonight. I'm sort of headed off in a different direction, but I do want to comment on the importance of time. And one of the things that classrooms don't have is enough time, ever. And so the use of the time in the classroom is particularly important because it is so precious. It is such a limited resource. And the other thing about time that I'm so passionate about is the misunderstanding about how long it takes to learn a language. And you know, apart from the magic formulas that you get on the backs of magazines that tell you 6 months will be enough for you to learn, I don't know, whatever language you're hoping for, the reality is that it takes years. And if you're like me, you're still learning the first language you ever knew. I learned new words, new ways of saying things, new expressions, new interpretations of words and sentences that I've known for years as I've been speaking it for, well, a long time. I won't even tell you how many, well, you can probably figure it out after a while. When I was first asked for a title, and I'd forgotten this completely, I sort of cheekily said, how about second language acquisition? Can you do it in a classroom? The point of that was to say, classroom is where you start learning. Nobody learns a language in the classroom because it's the place where you start learning. And that's, again, why it's so important for the classroom to do the right things, because what you want is for students to leave the classroom proud of what they've accomplished, motivated to look for more, and with the tools to continue learning outside the classroom. Because if they don't, they're sunk, unless they're truly exceptional learners. And I met a few of you, truly exceptional learners, but most people need a lot more time outside the classroom than they can ever get inside the classroom. And so the importance, though, of time comes back. So let me say a word about acquisition and learning. For me, it's not an important distinction. For me, it's all learning. But I understand that the term acquisition has been, what's the word? I'm losing my own, has been, not incorporated, what's the word? Appropriated, yes, the term, thank you, who said that? Thank you, yes, the term has been appropriated, thank you. The term acquisition has been appropriated to mean something different from learning. Those of you who've read the Purple Book or who've done other studies in second language acquisition understand that for some people, acquisition is something that happens when you're paying attention to something else. Those are Krashen's words. When you think you're doing something else, but you're actually acquiring a language. Whereas learning, he reserved for that which you do intentionally. And today we will talk about both of these kinds of ways of internalizing language, but I will tend not to make that as a distinction. I will talk about incidental learning, I'll talk about learning in an environment where you're focused on meaning, but I won't make the distinction between acquisition and learning. I'm just giving you a warning, a heads up. Okay. So, do classroom learners ever have enough time? I think you know my opinion about that. So my question is, if people are going to be learning languages in classrooms, how can second language acquisition research support learning in the classroom? Now, there's one way it can happen, and you'll see on the next slide one very innovative way for supporting learning in a classroom using second language acquisition research. You can take the textbook and use it to prop up the projector. This is an unretouched, authentic photograph taken by our colleague Leila Ranta at a classroom in Alberta. So that is support for language teaching in the classroom. But in order to support classroom language teaching, we all have to be aware of the students, the learners' expectations and their goals. Not every classroom learner has the same goals. Not every school system or parent group has the same expectations. If we make the mistake of comparing people by comparing them to the wrong metric, we make a very grave error, and we do a great disservice to the learners who have accomplished a great deal, but who have not accomplished some arbitrary expectation that is set by others. So we need to understand what the learners' expectations are, what they aspire to, what their goals are, and what they think they can accomplish, and what they're willing to work toward. Because at a certain point, everybody reaches a level of saying, okay, I'm okay with the way I am now. We used to have kids in our research environment in Montreal who were in an intensive communicative ESL class, which was not terribly intensive in spite of the label, but it was very communicative. It was communicative in the extreme. It was very much in the Krashenian perspective that you never correct, you never teach rules, you never do anything except interact and have fun and play games. And so the students in that class would reach a point where they would say, well, you understand me. Like, you understand me? That's as far as I don't need to go anywhere else. For them, they had reached a level where it was acceptable. Their language was really quite basic. They had reached very little, but who did they speak English? Who were they going to speak English with outside the classroom? Nobody. So as long as the teacher understood them, and of course, in a classroom like that, the teacher understood everybody because the teacher and the students all spoke the same variety of what I'll call interlanguage English. Some of you understand that terminology. Above all, language acquisition takes time. I cannot say that often enough. The hundreds of hours that are needed, indeed the thousands of hours, when we think about children coming to school on the first day of school, by the time they come to first grade or kindergarten even, they have already been learning their mother tongue for thousands and thousands of hours. Every time I do the calculation, I'm stunned by the number of hours the kids have been using language before they ever start school. And yet, somehow, people expect, I say people, and we won't define the people, but some people do expect that at the end of a year, a child who has come to school with no English should be able to just get on with it and go on and learn other stuff through English. It takes a lot of time, and we rarely acknowledge that fully. Time is a limited resource in life. Yeah, it is. Yeah, and time goes by very fast. And the reality is that you simply cannot teach everything. Even if you could, it wouldn't be a good idea, but the reality is you have only so much time in a classroom, you cannot teach everything, so you really do have to be selective and choose that which is most valuable. So how do we make the best use of classroom time? Well, the number one way of making the best use of classroom time is to emphasize meaning-focused learning. Instead of having learners learn stuff that they might someday find useful, find ways of making it meaningful at the moment. This is the greatest wisdom that we can offer to language teachers. Make it meaningful at the moment. In meaning-focused learning and teaching, the attention, the focal attention is on ideas and affect, things that matter, things that are important to you. Make it so that students want to know the answer to that question. Make it so they want to solve that riddle. Make it so they want to answer that puzzle. Find a way to make the language meaningful, and find a way to make it important. Find a way to make it feel important to the students. So if you're in a language classroom and you are looking for meaningful activities, those might be in listening activities or reading activities. Reading, depending on the age group that you're working with, and in some ways not depending on the age group you're working with, you may make particular choices for what people listen to or read, but every age group of learners benefits from hearing and reading language. Games create the need to have meaningful solutions. Even something as banal as a true-false exercise, instead of just having people read a sentence, have them read a sentence and tell you whether it's true or not. That is a kind of meaningful interaction of a very basic kind. Or questions about the news, if you dare, in a classroom. In task-based or project-based or immersion or mainstream classes, where content-based learning makes the learning meaningful. If you're in a content-based classroom, you need to learn the content, because otherwise you're not going to be successful in school. So the language is your vehicle for learning the content, and that is the way that the language is inherently meaningful. Students need to understand in order to get the math lesson. They need to understand in order to get the social studies lesson. So in meaning-focused, content-based learning, language is kind of like a clear glass. You're looking through it instead of at it. You're looking through it to the content. And the focus is on the content. So over the years since I've been doing research in classroom learning and other places for second language learning, one thing is absolutely certain. I mean, if the research evidence is overwhelming, it is possible to focus on meaning, not thinking about language, just focusing on understanding. As long as the context is appropriate, it is possible to acquire language incidentally. Furthermore, not all knowledge that we have is explicit. We don't actually know everything we know. That's particularly true the more proficient you are. The more proficient a speaker you are, the less you actually could describe what it is that you can do. And certainly, don't let anybody ask you questions about your native language, because there you're going to be completely at sea. As all of you who are native speakers of a language that you teach, you discover pretty quickly that students have questions that you cannot possibly answer. All you can say to them is, well, that's just the way we say it. That's just the way it is. Whereas a non-native teacher is much more likely to be able to say, the rule for that is this, always do this after this, okay? But if we are highly proficient speakers, especially speakers who've learned outside a classroom, the likelihood of our knowing what we know is actually pretty slim. Now there may be some exceptions in this room, because as we were saying with the doctoral students, this is probably a group of people who love language and just love to study language and talk about it. I was literally diagramming sentences when I was 5, 6 years old with my grandfather, but I've always loved language, and I still love grammar. I still think it's cool. But not every student does, and not every student really. And for many students, they can come to know things without actually knowing what it is that being able to say explicitly what they know. Now, not all learning goes from declarative to procedural. We talk in cognitive psychology terms about declarative learning, where you learn a fact and you know that, and then you keep working with that fact and you come to be able to access that information without thinking about it, and that becomes procedural knowledge, where you are able to do it without being aware of the rule that you're applying. But not all learning goes in that direction. Some of our learning occurs without that first declarative stage. So meaning-focused learning plays a valuable role in language acquisition. I mean, language is about meaning. That's what language is. And when we teach language in the absence of a meaningful focus, we're not doing what it is that language was made for. Now, obviously, you can be a theoretical linguist or a historical linguist or a philologist, and you could study language the same way that a biologist studies frogs. You can study it as an object, of course you can, but most students in most foreign and second language classrooms are looking for a tool that they will be able to use to express and understand meaning. And meaning-focused activities in the classroom are crucial for that to happen. So the likelihood that someone will in fact learn something through incidental exposure in meaningful interaction are affected. The likelihood is affected by a number of things. We know that frequency has been found to be a very important predictor of what people learn. The fact that somebody has heard something many times is a much better, or seen something many times, is a good predictor of their ability to remember it. Salience is almost as important. It's one thing to hear things frequently, it's something else to notice them. And without salience, things are overlooked. My most recent wonderful example of that, I really enjoyed this. It gave me such a good laugh. I had been invited to do a podcast interview with a young man from someplace far away. He's an British speaker of English. He was clearly very keen to get me to do the podcast, and we had a hard time scheduling it because I was busy, he was busy. We finally got it scheduled. And you're going to have to listen carefully because you might not get the joke, so listen up. So we finally got it together. We were on our Skype or Zoom or whatever it was, and he said, okay, we had a few little pleasantries about weather or something, and then he said, okay, ready to start? Yeah, okay. So, Dr. Lightbown, thank you. I said, whoa, let's try that again. He said, what? I said, what's the it's nothing, let's just start again. Okay. Dr. Lightbown, no. It took several iterations before he simply could not notice. He'd seen my name how many times? Presumably a lot, because he even got the email right, thank goodness, because otherwise I never would have had his messages. But for him, the salience was completely missing. The frequency did not make up for the absence of salience, and the expectation that Brown would be the form, and it was close enough. Anyway, it was quite funny, but it was an opportunity to talk about noticing and how things can be present in your environment, and you will never learn them unless somebody draws your attention to them. And we had a good laugh, and then we started again. Dr. Lightbown, thank you for being here. Form, meaning, relationships. We know that for learning, it helps if words and phrases have a relationship to meaning that is fairly transparent in the early stages, at least, and that learners can make the link between form and meaning. Time and practice. Again, you'll see I keep coming back to time. The issue of practice is a tricky one because people misunderstand the meaning of practice, and we'll talk some more about that as we go forward. And I always like to admit my errors, and one of my biggest errors in professional life was in an article that I published in 1985, where I was just emerging from my experience as a teacher of French, audiolingual French, and passing through learning more about language acquisition and being terribly certain of myself. I mean, it was 1985, so I was young, and I knew a lot more than I know now. So I said, I had this little phrase that practice does not make perfect. And of course, my point was, drill, mindless, meaningless drill, does not achieve the purpose that it is meant to, that people thought it would achieve back in the days of the audiolingual teaching. So I was really talking about practice that is not meaningful, where you're repeating things, but it doesn't mean anything to you. Boy, did I get slammed for that, and justifiably, because practice is not that thing. Whatever it was we were doing in audiolingual teaching back in the day, that was not the kind of, what you want to practice, as we'll say in a moment again, what you want to practice is what you want people to be able to do. And if you want them to be able to repeat after me, then go ahead, practice that. If you want them to be able to fill in one blank in the sentence, go ahead, practice that. They'll be able to do that. But if you want them to be able to generalize beyond those things that you've been drilling, then obviously you want to emphasize more of a meaning-focused interaction. Motivation and investment are obviously, it goes back to the idea of goals and expectations. If people are really not interested in learning, then they can be in the presence of the best possible opportunities for learning, and they will shut down. And it is their, except when they have to pass an exam, I suppose you could say it's their right. And in much adult education literature, there is a really serious concern about the lack of respect for the agency of the learner. That people who are adults who are placed in a position where they need to learn a new language, or where everybody else thinks they need to learn a new language, it's difficult to accept that sometimes they decide that they won't, that they just won't. And when that happens, then their motivation and their willingness to invest in the challenge is lost. Long, long ago, we understood that emotion and affect are powerful in how we learn, and that placing people in environments where they are stressed or anxious or intimidated doesn't promote learning, except sometimes it promotes momentary learning out of fear, but in order to encourage longer-term retention and longer-term connections with new elements of language, positive emotions and affects are much more effective for the long-term learning. So we know that the value of meaning-focused learning is enormous. It's important for motivation. There's a reason to learn. It helps me if I'm in a meaning-focused environment because I want to know the answer to the question. Transfer-appropriate processing, that means that you are learning to use language in a way that will be appropriate when you are in another environment. To repeat the example of the drill, people don't repeat after me very much out in the real world. There are some places where that's not true. There are some places where people do that, but it's unusual. What's much more likely to happen is that you need to be prepared to answer an unexpected question, to answer a question to which the person you're talking to doesn't already know the answer. But in classrooms, the frequency with which that happens are disappointingly low. Teachers tend to ask questions to which they already know the answer. This is related to the specificity of practice that I was referring to before. You learn what you practice, but it doesn't necessarily generalize to other things. So you need to practice. If you want people to learn to use language meaningfully, that's what you want them to be practicing. So most important, meaning-focused learning prepares students to continue learning outside the classroom. I've said that before, I can't say it often enough. A classroom is where you start learning, so you want the classroom to prepare a student to continue learning beyond the classroom. Now, the other thing that research has been very clear about is that for people to learn language incidentally through meaning-focused interaction, they have to have massive amounts of that exposure, massive amounts of exposure. If you're learning without guidance, if you're just focusing on meaning and not learning language at the same time, you can be disappointed in the outcome because people need lots of language. Children are wonderful at incidental learning. That's what they do best. But in order to do that, they need to have, again, thousands of hours of exposure, and we underestimate the amount of time that they need. Massive amounts of instruction. So what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Well, one of the ways we increase time for learning is through things like immersion, or content and language integrated learning, or English medium instruction, which is very popular throughout the world, where instead of teaching English, we teach other subjects through English. All of this are examples of that. And of course, for some people, the idea is that children who are speakers of a second language, who need to learn English as a second language, should just be plunked in with the other children, using the logic, the common sense that is so wrong that the best way for a child to learn a language is for the child to just be plunked in without any ceremony. This is not. This has not been borne out by research. In any case, meaning-focused learning is not enough if the goal of learning is accurate, sophisticated, flexible, fluent, pragmatically appropriate language use. Very few people will reach this level purely on the basis of meaning-focused interaction. The exceptions are people whose lives have taken them into an environment where that is often where it's the only language they use, and they arrive in those situations prepared for it in some way. But for most people, and certainly for people whose primary exposure to the language is in a classroom, this will not happen with only meaning-focused instruction. So learners also need language-focused learning. So, meaning-focused learning and language-focused learning. Well, if you've been reading the literature, you know all the different other terms like focus on form, or metalinguistic reflection, or metalinguistic studies, or intentional learning to contrast with incidental, declarative knowledge, explicit learning. This is what I'm talking about when I say language-focused learning. It can be called by many different things, but the point is that it's language-focused learning where you stop focusing on the meaning and you focus, at least for a time, on the language itself. And in giving attention to language itself, you might be focusing on vocabulary. Vocabulary ought to be written in mile-high letters. It is so important. It's the heart of everything else. And that was also one of the problems with back in the day when we were trying to teach languages through pattern practices and so forth. We kept minimizing the importance of vocabulary and emphasizing the importance of structure, grammar, instead of realizing that vocabulary is at the heart of it all. Pronunciation is also important. It's also a part of language-focused learning. Morphology and syntax, clearly you have to, we're talking about learning the grammar of a language. But also we have learned increasingly that things like register, genre, pragmatics, those things are also teachable. For too long, we thought that those were things that would somehow just be picked up incidentally, or that they were too hard to teach. But increasingly, we have evidence that these are important things to teach as well, and in fact, essential in some situations. So why do learners need language-focused learning? Why can't they just get, why do we want to just send them out to get more and more meaning-focused learning? Well, we've already talked about the issue of time. But apart from the issue of time, the two main things I want to focus on are cognitive processing capacity and the quality and completeness of authentic language. So, cognitive processing capacity simply means it's hard to focus on language form and meaning at the same time. So if you're a student in the classroom and you're watching the teacher do this fancy thing with the chemicals in the chemistry lab, you're probably not paying too much attention to what the teacher is saying. You're just paying attention to how the change takes place in the test tube. Mm-hmm. Meaning always wins. Again, the research is very clear, with the exception of people who are specially trained linguistic snoops. In a contest between meaning and form, meaning will win. You'll pay attention to the meaning. We've got plenty of evidence to show that. So, multitasking is not the magic that some people think it is. We humans are not very good at multitasking. What we're pretty good at, some of us better than others, is switching attention. We can pay attention to one thing and then pay attention to another thing. And our ability to switch attention is actually a pretty good predictor of our success in some language learning situations. But to try to get both at the same time without acknowledging that both language and meaning, language form and language meaning, have to be attended to, acting as if the language form will somehow just be available, is overlooking the fact that we're not very good at doing two things at once. And in order to make sure that attention is paid to both language form and language meaning, we need to recognize the primacy of meaning. People always pay attention to that first, and you have to draw their attention to form if you want them to really notice it. Quality and completeness, still of course related to the issue of time, but even if you are exposed to a lot of language, some important language features are either rare, it's just the nature of language that they don't come up very often. Sometimes they're just absent. There are things that are important to know, but if all of your language exposure is in so-called meaning-focused activities, you may miss some of these things because they don't happen to come up. It's astonishing when you do the analyses, and corpus linguistics gives us good information about this reality. There are features of language that we all think are obvious and ordinary, that are actually much more rare than we expect. There are also even things that are present in the language, may be so non-salient and hard to perceive in normal speech that they may be there, normal speech or text, they may be there, but they're not seen. Lightbown being maybe a good example. So quality and completeness, think about all those silly little English grammatical morphemes that don't really do very much for meaning, but there they are, all spread all through the, we don't have, I mean, English morphology is pretty pitiful, but we do have some morphology, and we do like to put third person singular on the S, or on the plural. So, but that's just so, it's so unimportant. It's so, and it just passes by like that. So who's to notice that if somebody doesn't point it out to you? Astonishingly, I mean, there's no sentence in French that doesn't likely have an article or an agreement marker in it, and yet learners can go for years and not kind of get it that they have to make agreement between the articles, or not get the right article even though it's been there, or apparently been there. Case markings in Spanish pronouns. People think that the first pronoun must be the subject because that's the way it is in English, and they don't notice that the case marking should tell them something other. We've seen funny things like the absence of past tense in history class. That was a finding from many years ago when Meryl Swain was looking at French immersion classes, and she expected to look in the French history class and find examples of past tense, and what she found instead was the teacher using historical present. And so it would be, the ships leave New England and they travel to the Caribbean, then they go to the African coast, this kind of historical present, perfectly correct, perfectly grammatical, but how are you going to learn the past tense if you never hear it? And even in a history lesson, students were not hearing it. Counterfactuals in science class, and there should be opportunities for students to learn the formal way of presenting a hypothesis and a conclusion, but not all science classes will include those examples. So, in order for learners to see the details, they need to do it intentionally or on purpose, as we like to say. They need to have their attention brought intentionally to some of the features of language. And second language acquisition research has confirmed the value of both meaning-focused and language-focused learning. We have plenty of evidence to show that meaning-focused learning is crucial, but language-focused learning can help. But how much of each and when? How much meaning-focused learning? How much language-focused learning? So one of the responses to that question comes from Paul Nation. And I know that some of you will be familiar with his work. If I did oh gosh, I'm losing my words, speaking of vocabulary. Actually, I just said the magic word, didn't I? I was going to say if I did what am I trying to say?
Paul?
Yeah, Paul. I got the name, but I'm just trying to say, in psychology, when they show you a word and you have to say the first thing that comes to mind?
Like free association.
Free association, yeah. So like word association, free association. So if I say Paul Nation, somebody's going to say vocabulary, because that's where he has done his major research. And to be sure, he is probably one of the most respected figures in the area of taking it to the classroom, bringing it to the classroom level. His research is rich and very expensive, and he has worked with teachers all over the world to help them improve their teaching, specifically of vocabulary. However, as soon as I saw what I'm going to be talking about next, I knew that his work in vocabulary was generalizable to other aspects of language learning as well. So, how many of you are familiar with the Four Strands, Paul Nation's Four Strands? Through reading one of my articles, okay. Good. I'm glad that not everybody raised their hand, because otherwise I would have nothing more to say. We could just go home now. But Paul Nation's Four Strands reflect his proposal for how classroom time should be used to the greatest benefit of learning. So there are 4 strands. What I love about the 4 strands is number one, that it is absolutely compatible with the research I know in second language acquisition. It is absolutely compatible. There is nothing in what he says or proposes that comes out of left field. Even though he's not known as a second language researcher, this is, I mean, he's really much more known as a pedagogue. He's a vocabulary researcher, but when it comes to classroom learning, he's much more a teacher than a researcher in the classroom. But everything I know about this comes from, it matches what I know about second language acquisition research, and it is so clear and straightforward that I think it's an extremely valuable tool for working with new teachers especially, who are not quite sure how to divide up the day. I mean, let's be honest, in this world, if you ask a teacher, you know, what do you teach? And they'll tell you what class they teach or what level they teach, and they'll say, well, what's the curriculum? And they'll either say, you know, it's the Ministry of Education curriculum, and maybe they would or wouldn't say that, or they'll hold up the textbook. That's probably 95% of the world. The teacher has the textbook. So this is something that is straightforward enough that even if you're relying on the textbook, you can use this to superimpose it on the textbook and say, am I getting enough of this? Am I getting enough of that? Does the textbook lead my students to get this and that and the other strands? So even for teachers who have not studied acquisition research or who are not necessarily open to the idea that second language acquisition research or any other kind of research is going to affect what they do in the classroom, I think Nation's 4 Strands approach is clear and simple enough that many teachers can adopt it as a framework for thinking about their teaching. So the first strand is meaning-focused input. And the meaning-focused input is very similar to what Steve Krashen called comprehensible input. So the idea of meaning-focused input is that you are hearing or reading something for the purpose of understanding it, and with the goal of understanding it, because it's interesting, because it's important to you in some way, and one of my favorites is because it's appropriate. And I chose appropriate because I see so many situations where especially adult learners are being taught using materials that are not age appropriate, that they are not challenging or engaging at the level where the adult is. Using childish materials is not the way of making things appropriate. So, meaning-focused input should include both listening and reading. For learners who do not read, obviously you can't impose that until there's an opportunity for them to learn that, but listening and reading are important. And this is the other thing. This is where Nation's ideas start to get pretty precise. Mostly known words and patterns. So if you're trying to read something and understand it, if you don't know most of the words, you're going to have a hard time understanding what you're reading. Now, we all know that expression, guess from context. You know that expression? Guessing from context is actually it's a good strategy. It's a good thing to learn to do, but it's extremely difficult. There are so many wonderful examples of why you might get it wrong. One of the ones that comes to mind immediately is there's a sentence sort of like, Maisie's a really good dancer, isn't she? She said grumpily. Or, Maisie is a really good dancer, isn't she? She said admiringly. Are you a good dancer? But the, if you don't know if you don't know grumpily and admiringly, how do you figure out which of those it is? I mean, she's a good dancer. I'm seeing her. I can say I got that part. How does that help me know what the rest is? So if you don't know most of the words, then guessing from context will be so frustrating that you will eventually bail out. You won't continue. But if you only read stuff you already knew, you wouldn't learn any new stuff. So it's mostly known words and patterns. And again, if you look at the actual research on how much mostly means, it is astonishing. if I want to read a text and I know 80% of the words, I'm toast. I will not be able to read it. Think about it. 1 in 5 words. I don't know what it means. So the evidence seems to be that mostly known language means 95 to 98% of the words in a text must be known in order for somebody to read with understanding. Now that may happen because there was advanced teaching. That may happen because you've got, well, there are lots of things you can talk about. You can provide contextual support, obviously. You can assess the students' prior knowledge and get them to think about what they already know about the topic, and that will help to work. You can teach them strategies that include things like guessing from context, but guessing from context is something that you have to work at. You have to learn how to do it, just as you have to learn how to use a dictionary, for example. That's not something that is easy and automatic. Scaffolding clearly is a crucial part of helping learners understand what they are hearing or reading. So it could be listening to stories, or it could be listening to or reading academic content. It could be watching the news. It could be conversations, interactive, task-based group work, or just things that are going on in the classroom, just what's happening in the classroom, as long as it matters for you to understand it, as long as you need to know what it means, and you know most of the words, and it has some new words, some new material. Movies and soap operas and YouTube videos are wonderful teaching tools, as I think many of you probably know. And one of the benefits of them is that students can watch them over and over again, over and over again. And that takes us back to the issue of frequency and salience, where contextual support, all of those things can be used to help learners acquire and understand the language that's in these. So whether they're purpose-built things that the teacher has created for the purpose of giving students access to meaning-focused input, or whether they are things that the students have chosen themselves, that the students identify and choose to read or listen to, they all provide the value of multiple repetitions, frequency, and salience. So we said 4 strands, okay? So we got meaning-focused input. What do you suppose is going to come next? Yeah. Meaning-focused output. So it's all very well to understand what you hear and what you see, but the evidence suggests that until you have to actually produce language, whether it's written or spoken, you are still going to fall short in learning what you're trying to learn. So again, the main goal is to say what you mean, or to write what you mean. That's meaning-focused output. Means you're saying something that matters. You're saying something that you want somebody to actually understand. Whether speaking or writing, again, mostly known language. But here's the thing. Mostly known language means that, well, you could, okay, using communication strategies that we talked about, scaffolding and context and so forth, pair group, interaction, asking, you know, all the sorts of things you do in a classroom. But then, if you're trying to express meaning in meaning-focused output, you will find a place where you say, how do you say that? I don't know that word. Do you know I have been in classrooms where students have been in the class studying a language for 6 months or more, and they haven't learned how to say, how do you say this in English? I don't understand. Could you repeat that, please? Can you imagine? They've been in classrooms learning English, but they haven't learned these little tools that allow them to ask when they run into problems and they need some new language. So if they're trying to express meaning, learners are going to realize, this was of course Merrill Swain's comprehensible output point, that when you come to the point where you don't know how to say something, then you're motivated to try to figure it out. You look for a solution to your problem. So how do you get that new language if you come to a place where you don't know? Well, partly you get it through the incidental learning from meaning-focused input. That was what we were saying. If you're reading something where you know 98% of the words, you still have 2% that you've got to learn, that you can learn from the meaning-focused use. It should be said, however, that incidental learning during meaning-focused input is possible only if we use mostly known language. So there may still be things that we don't get. So how do they access that new language? Partly through intentional, effortful, language-focused learning, on purpose. So, language-focused learning. Whether that language-focused learning takes place independently, as the student goes and gets a dictionary and looks up a word, or if it takes place through a teacher's lesson. Language-focused learning introduces new language. It draws attention deliberately to the new language. Students are called upon to make an effort to learn that new language. They have spaced and repeated opportunities to focus on those language features. It's not expected that because I taught it today, you'll still know it next week. If I taught it today, I should be using it again in a couple of days and then again in a couple of weeks. It needs to be spaced and repeated, spaced and repeated. And the things that we focus on in language-focused learning have to be within learners' developmental ability. Another serious issue that we see in language classrooms is teachers teaching things that students are clearly not able to learn yet because of where they are developmentally. And that's something that I know many of you have read that I've got a lot to say about. But the point is that you can teach somebody something explicitly and you can get them to memorize it. But if they're to integrate it into their ongoing language development, they need to be at a point where they are developmentally ready to accept it. So, stopping to look at the language itself, so taking the focus back from the meaning and focusing on language itself. But here's the most important thing about language-focused learning. The most important thing, and the thing that I find too often absent in a lot of language-focused learning in classrooms. Language-focused activities should support the meaning-focused strand. I mean, if you're teaching, if you're doing in your language-focused strand, if you're reading a story about horses, then you don't, in your language-focused strand, go and conjugate verbs to the passé simple. I mean, or the whatever the pluperfect subjunctive. You use language in the language-focused elements that talk about that allow the learner to better access the language that's present in the meaning-focused activities. The purpose of language-focused learning is to make meaning-focused learning more effective. So, language-focused learning could be structured input or enhanced input, where you expose students to input that is very specifically designed to show them a particular language feature, particular grammatical point, particular vocabulary words. Input processing, which is an approach to learning that has been championed by Bill Van Patten and his students, where you create materials that force students to understand what they're reading in order you force students to identify the grammatical features correctly to make sense of the sentence or to understand it correctly. You prevent them from guessing the meaning by creating materials that force them to correctly grasp the grammar. Intensive reading, a staple of international English classes, but a valuable one because it says, let's look at this, let's look at exactly how the meaning is being made in this passage. Let's look at the vocabulary, let's look at the structure, let's look at the connections, focusing right on the language itself. Dictionary work again. People aren't born knowing how to use dictionaries. There's plenty of evidence for that in wonderful classroom examples where students look things up in the dictionary and just go completely off the track because they don't know how to use the dictionary well. Closed texts are valuable too, where it's a way of getting students to say, you got to pay attention to exactly what fits in that slot, not just kind of vaguely go past over it. Pronunciation practice, real pronunciation practice. Big favorite of pollination, vocabulary cards and notebooks. Dictation and dictogloss, where dictation, which is what it looks like, but dictogloss is where the students hear a passage read quickly and then have to reconstruct it. Not to write it down word for word as you do in a dictation, but where you have to write, oh, I think she said this, and you have to write, and you recreate the passage from your memory, and it's best done in interactive groups. And yes, grammar exercises, yeah, there's value in grammar exercises. Explicit feedback on error. That's not the way it's said. You need to say it this way. Pattern practice, drill, yeah, that's okay too, as part of language-focused learning. As part of language-focused learning, there are situations where it's perfectly appropriate to get people to practice making their tongues and teeth say exactly what they're trying to say, exactly that way. But it's language-focused. It's saying this is how you make your lips. I mean, I will never forget being told how to pronounce the French U. Just that you know that I just will never forget it. I don't know that I get it right every time, but it was very explicitly taught to me, and I remember. Metalinguistic explanation and first and second language comparisons. The fear that people sometimes have of introducing the first language into the classroom is very unfounded. The first language is a magnificent resource for learners, and helping them to see how the first language and the second language do things is a crucial gift to learners as they attempt to learn a new language. Also, as part of language-focused learning, strategies for learning how to learn. So that when we talked before about guessing from context, that's a strategy that learners need to be taught. It should not be assumed that they know how to do it. They need to be taught how to do it, and then how to look at a text or hear a text read and to figure out what is being said, or to figure out what the features ought to be. But this is part of language-focused learning. So there are many, many kinds of, oh yeah, and did I mention, the purpose of language-focused learning is to support meaning-focused language learning. It's not an end unto itself, except for those of us who are linguists by persuasion, or somehow just like to study language for the fun of it. But for most people, the point of the language-focused learning is to help with meaning-focused learning. Okay, so let's see, we've had 3 strands. I always do this when I talk about these 3 strands. Okay, we got meaning-focused input, meaning-focused output, language-focused learning, and if you haven't read one of those articles, what's left? Actually, if you have read one of those articles, I'd be delighted to know that you remembered what I said. Yeah. They didn't hear you in the back though, so it's okay. They can still tell me what they think. No, they're not going to tell me. What do you reckon is left? We've talked about meaning-focused input, meaning-focused output, language-focused learning. What else is there in language learning that you could possibly do? Well, I tease you, but I can tell you, and you're particularly smiling because I think you've probably heard me talk about this before, or at least you've read it. I have, in the quite a large number of times that I have talked about this and presented it to groups of people, I think once somebody in the audience came up with the idea independently who did not know the word. So turns out to be a really important strand, but doesn't immediately come to mind. And when I tell you what it is, at first you're not going to like it, because you're going to say, didn't we talk about that already? But it's not that important. Fluency development. Fluency development. What the heck is that? Fluency development. Does that just mean teaching people to talk faster? Fluency development is repeatedly using what you already know so that you can do it faster and more automatically. And also, I will say later, also more accurately. So you will hear in the literature fluency contrasted with accuracy. That is not what we're talking about here. We're not saying be fluent or be accurate. That is not what this is. This is be accurate and be fluent. Because you are practicing often enough something that you can already do, but you're doing it often enough that you become able the subclass of learning that deals only with improving performance on a task that can already be successfully performed. Well, what a waste of classroom time. Why would you spend your time on fluency development? Here's another important thing that people may not understand right away. Fluency development is a meaning-focused strand. It's not drill and kill. It's not repeat after me. Fluency development means using language meaningfully over and over again. And in some situations, it's easy to imagine what that might be. If you're, I don't know, if you're teaching an English for academic or for specific purposes and you're teaching service encounters, I mean, you know, there are situations where you're going to say the same thing over and over again, and that makes some sense. But other times you have to be a little more creative. But fluency development is a meaning-focused strand, so you're asking people to do something where they are expressing meaning or understanding, and that's the other piece that may be missed, because we're talking about all four of the obvious skills. We're not just talking about speaking faster, we're talking about listening faster too, and reading and writing faster and more accurately. So fluency in this definition is about developing automaticity, but doing what you're doing accurately and meaningfully. So, fluency development. Announcements. Today we're going to do such and such a thing. Classroom routines, giving and receiving directions. Task repetition, where students do an activity and then they move to another group and they do the same activity again, but they do it with a different group of people. Reading texts that you've read before and that you already know perfectly, where you know all the words, but now you're going to read it better and faster. 10-minute writing, where you are given a writing task, and you're given a limited time in which to write that, and with time, you discover that you can put more words on the page accurately in that 10-minute frame than you thought you ever could. 4-3-2 speaking is, I tell you something, and I have 4 minutes in which to tell it to you, and then I have to turn and tell somebody else, but I only have 3 minutes to tell it to them, and then I move to the next person, and I have only 2 minutes. So I've practiced saying it, and I'm saying it to a different person each time, so each time it's new information to that person I'm talking to, but it allows me to say it faster and more accurately. Speeded listening, listening to things that are where the speech is faster than students are accustomed to, where they are expected to listen to things at a normal rate. Performances, skits, songs, poems, debates, where students have to say things in a repeated. So why is it so important to have fluency development? What's the purpose? I joked about why would you waste your classroom time on it. It actually is a hugely important piece of learning, because simplest, most superficial sense, it builds confidence and motivation. If somebody reaches the point where they can, the more you can say automatically, the more confident you feel, the more you're willing to talk to other people, the more you're willing to try yourself. So learning how to say simple things that allow you to interact with people outside the classroom would be an important aspect of fluency development. But even more important, fluency development allows a learner to save cognitive processing space so that the learner can start to look at new information. The more you can do automatically, the more space you have to allow new things to come into your knowledge. So, fluency development. We've got 4 strands. So now we've said 4 strands. When do you introduce each of the strands, and how much of each strand, how much of your time do you devote to each of the strands? Well, if you're Paul Nation, you'll say all 4 strands should be present in equal amounts and with equal importance from the beginning of language learning. That's pretty strong stuff. But the idea is that if you are a creative and thoughtful teacher, it is possible to imagine even fluency development as a meaningful interaction from the first day of class. I mean, isn't that what you're doing when you teach students to say, good morning, how are you? Good morning. That's part of fluency development, where you get students to talk about the weather, you get students to talk about taking out their books and understanding. All of those things are part of language learning from the early stages. Nation are used from the very beginning in equal amounts. Now, I've said to you that when I discovered Nation, the Four Strands, I was confident that the Four Strands are compatible with what I know about second language acquisition research, but I'll tell you the truth. There has not been a lot of research taking the Four Strands approach itself and testing it out in research environments. That's the truth. So, is he right about giving equal time to each strand? That's the claim. And in his context of where he's focused on vocabulary development, then maybe we've got enough evidence to support that. But if we're looking at other aspects of language, do we have enough evidence yet to know if we need to give equal attention to all? And maybe even more important for some of you, I'm sure, how should overall learning context and learners' proficiency affect the Four Strands in classroom instruction? So for example, if you're teaching learners who are exposed to the language a great deal outside the classroom, then maybe you want to spend more of your classroom time focused on language-focused learning, certain kinds of fluency development, because they're getting a lot of meaning-focused input and opportunities for output outside. But it is not necessarily the case that they're able to use all of that meaning-focused input and meaning-focused output that they're getting outside if it does not obey the rule of mostly known language that is needed for those encounters. So on the one hand, it's certainly true that if you take the overall context of learning into consideration, you might say, in my classroom we're going to do more language-focused learning because our students get a lot of exposure outside, but if that language-focused learning that you're doing in the classroom does not support their learning outside the classroom, then you're doing what has been done in language classes for too many generations. You're just teaching something because it's the next page in the textbook, and that's not what will help them to deal with what they're having to deal with outside. Are there differences in outcomes when language-focused learning is isolated or integrated? There are different views of how it matters whether whether students are learning something in the heat of the moment because something comes up and it's then integrated into the instruction at the moment, or whether they need to be whether things need to be taken out. There are strong arguments for both, and both have a role in language-focused learning, both isolated and integrated learning, but they need to be defined and they need to be tested. A really difficult question: which language features must be explicitly taught or learned, and which can be acquired incidentally? We are making progress in that department, but there's still an enormous amount of research remaining to be done. But the two main takeaways that I would want to leave you with from the Four Strands approach is that 3 out of the 4 strands are meaning focused. To repeat, language is about meaning. So language teaching should also be about meaning. And when language-focused learning is employed, it should be in support of meaning-focused acquisition and use. Depending on where I am in the world, when I talk about this, I sometimes I feel that this is a very important conclusion, because I find that sometimes people who have been sort of pushed towards so-called communicative language teaching and whose hearts are really still back in grammar translation or audiolingual, heaven help us, when they hear language-focused learning, they say, oh, good, that's what I'll do then, and they think that that's got to take up the big space, but no, it's one strand, 4 strands, it's one strand. Language-focused learning, and not only is it just one strand, it is a strand that is meant to support the meaning-focused learning. So I have absolutely no idea what time it is, but I will say thank you now and invite you to ask questions. And I also invite you to continue asking me questions next week, next month, next year. And I look forward to continuing to talk with you. Yes.
Can you comment on the value or not of when students are doing like reading focused output and they come up to a word they don't know, like the, I don't know how to say this, of in the moment just plopping that down in their language, especially with same language peers, to then, you know, like if I'm writing along and then I drop a word in English and note to myself, I better go back and look this up, but right now I'm writing.
Sounds like a great strategy.
Okay.
Sounds like a great strategy. You don't interrupt the task at hand. You've marked it, so you know that you need to come back to it. Sounds like a good thing to do. That's maybe other views. Oh dear, I talked too much. That happens. Yes.
What would you say about lexiled texts or altered texts in the classroom where students were looking at the Penguin edition of Moby Dick, 30 pages, rewritten? So you're saying that if much of the vocabulary needs to be known, then that might be an argument for the lexiled text. My heart is not with that decision, that choice, but.
Yeah, I'm trying to. I'm not really understanding the word you're using because it's obviously something that I don't know about.
Okay.
Lexile.
Texts that are not authentic, like they're not
Okay,
reading
like graded
Melville's
readers,
Moby
things that are
Dick.
simplified text.
Simplified, so that much of the language.
And you don't think that's a good idea?
Oh, I don't know.
I better admit, I love graded readers. I absolutely adore graded readers.
I studied literature before I.
But it depends, yeah, of course, absolutely. It depends, and what's the purpose of, why are they reading it? And where are they in their developmental curve? So you can give a student an authentic text to read. They will be totally frustrated. They will have to look up every third word. They will say, I hate Moby Dick. I never want to see it again, and that'll be the end of it. But you can also give them a modified or simplified version that might pique their interest, and that they will come back and read it again when they have a higher proficiency. I will say that no, I really think, honestly, I was joking, but I honestly believe that graded readers are one of the great gifts to language teachers. I wish all languages had them. English is rich with them, but many languages, we just don't have enough examples of them. My own, and see, maybe I'm partly influenced by, I'm certainly influenced by research, but I also have my personal anecdote from when I started learning French at age 15. And I had 1 year of really nice, I guess 3 hours a week of French, and I didn't know much, but I was at my grandparents' house and I came across a book that had belonged to my mother's sister, older sister, and it was her French, from her French class, and it was called A Simplified French Reader. And it was full of fairy tales and other familiar texts, simplified, and I took that thing and I opened it and I thought, wow, I can read French. I was so motivated and so thrilled to have access to that level of language that was appropriate for me, and I've seen students experience that. I've seen, graded readers. Some of them are exceptionally good. They're not all equal. And of course, you want students to be aspiring to reading authentic texts. But for them to get there, they have to be able to, build up their proficiency. So I happen to love those. Thanks for the question. You were going to say something.
Yeah, I just recently started teaching Portuguese to English speakers. It's a basic course, conversational Portuguese on the Cape. I don't know if you're familiar with
I'm
it.
very familiar.
I will
Yes.
take the joke. I'll become a joke now. But what would you say to a student? Because if on one hand I feel very pleased that they are asking questions, but some questions are clearly too advanced to that level, and then I'll get into a discussion of, that's too involved for the level in which they are in. But on the other hand, I don't want to discourage them because they're noticing and it's important. How would you handle?
I think you do exactly as you suggest. You say, that's really difficult. That's quite an advance. We'll get to that, but
Okay.
right now let's stay with this that we're working on here. Let's. The best way to do it is keep them busy doing something that they can do, so that they don't spend too much time thinking about what they can't do. And yeah.
What are your views on the integration of culture and critical inquiry? Where do they fit within the 25?
Oh, golly. That's a wonderful question, and a truly complicated one, because the answer to it will depend so much on the context in which the language is being taught. We had some really great but brief discussions of this in the group of doctoral students that I met with yesterday and today. The idea of teaching language without culture is a nonsense. It's like speaking without an accent. It's the same kind of foolishness. There's no such thing as language without culture. But then, what is culture, and which culture are we talking about? And just a minute now. Wait a minute. It was your research project. Okay. For a minute there, I was not sure I was remembering correctly. Your research project that showed that the culture that was represented for learners of French through most textbooks is almost entirely France, almost entirely within France, Paris, whereas, as you pointed out, 75% of the world's French speakers are actually on the African continent, and yet they are not represented in the textbooks that are used to teach people French. So why am I learning French? I suppose I'm learning it so I can go to Paris, instead of teaching people the broader context of French culture. But then you also, and then we had other, I'm trying to remember who said what, but then we had the issue of teaching, was it you, Maisie?
Yeah.
Yes, poor Maisie, tried to teach a lesson about Christmas.
Yeah.
And she really got hammered for presenting something that was so culturally fraught, I suppose you'd say. She was trying to choose something that was typical and American and English, but she got in trouble because it was seen as something that she was presenting something to her students that was not appropriate as part of their cultural understanding of it's an extremely hard. You asked me probably the hardest question. What is clear to me is that all language teaching involves teaching culture, whether it's by the way you present yourself or by the way the textbook presents the language. How do I answer that question? Do you have an answer?
That's what I asked.
It's part of, to be sure, it's part of, to be absolutely clear, it is certainly part of meaning-focused learning, although you could also certainly imagine a language-focused strand related to culture, which I think is something that I've heard a number of you talk about, teaching culture in the students' primary language, to be sure that they understand what you're teaching them. So that there's sort of two sides of that. There's teaching culture as part of a language lesson, but there's also teaching culture as preparation for a language lesson. So in that sense, it could be part of this, strategies for learning. It could actually be delivered outside the language lesson itself. But then, if it doesn't come back into the meaning-focused activities, it doesn't take. It isn't part of what you want to teach, what you want them to choose to learn.
Currently, I started teaching ESL intermediate English at pre-college at University English Intensive English program, and I realized that our students are even though they are called intermediate students, they have different proficiency levels. And in your presentation, you were frequently mentioned something new, something old, known information, old information, or new information.
Yeah.
As an experienced pedagogue or language teacher, what would you suggest for us to identify what is new for those students and what is old or unknown for them?
Yeah.
Because
of course, again, in a room like this, you probably get as many answers as there are people in the room, and certainly in every class will have a different answer. And so, if you're talking about children at an early stage, you can do all sorts of things like word webs and Venn diagrams and so forth. But you can do the same thing with older learners, depending on. It's always a matter of trying to get them to tell you what they know. To try to elicit from them the knowledge that they already have. It's a motivator, and it's also informational for you as the teacher to know if you get them to brainstorm vocabulary before they write an essay about something or other, then you have some idea of what vocabulary they have access to, what sorts of phrases or expressions they already know, and then you can start to enrich those and add to them as they get ready to do the writing task. These are all wonderful questions, and they are essentially a course in themselves. They demand so much of the teacher. Teaching is hard. Teaching is very hard. It is, and it is. But it's so important. It is. It's worth it.
We don't have any other questions?
I have one. You mentioned in your presentation today that L1 is very important and is an important device in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And we have read a lot and talked a lot in our classes about using this as a pedagogical device to help our students, especially if they're multilingual. To what extent you see that? To what is the purpose of the L1 in the classroom? How can we use it purposely in our classrooms and not just for the sake of using that language?
Oh, another full course we could do here, but we've seen the role of the L1 go through cycles over generations of language teaching, where everything was in terms of translation, and everything, there had to be a match of the L1 and the L2. That was the whole point of learning a language, was to be able to translate from one to the other. And then we went through the period where, oh my goodness, I remember when I was being trained, and I like to use the word trained because it felt rather military when I was being trained as an audiolingual teacher. I once was asked to do a report on something that was in those days called compound and coordinate bilingualism. That's kind of we've lost that over the years, but there was this distinction made between compound and coordinate bilingualism. The idea was that coordinate bilingualism was like two brains. One was speaking English and one was speaking French, and they were just separate. Coordinate bilingualism. And then there was compound bilingualism, which was where you learned French in terms of English, and I learned when I gave my report that was a bad thing. When I learned that from my teacher, who was all about separating the languages, never letting them see each other or come in contact with each other. So that was back in, that was a long time ago. That would be 1967, I think. But the idea that we can separate the language, the human brain doesn't work that way. There is some evidence that we have that there are separations of language, that there are contexts that the human mind allows you to retain knowledge of one language and lose another language, but mostly your languages are pretty integrated in the brain. And the idea that you can just suddenly not know your L1 because you're now trying to learn the L2 is just foolishness. So we've made tremendous progress in that area. We've come to understand that bringing the learner's L1 into the classroom as a legitimate tool is acceptable, but more than a legitimate tool for learning the second language, also as part of the learner's identity. Why park your identity at the door? You are still that person. You are still that speaker. So you've got those kinds of issues, but even in pure terms of language acquisition, using the L1 as a kind of scaffolding, even if you don't, this is one of the, I think, some of the best and most interesting research, even for teachers who don't speak the L1 of the student, the L1 can still sometimes be used as you get the student to reflect on how would you say that in your language, and let's talk about how that works. And again, if we're talking about beginners, we would use the L1 in certain ways. If we're talking about more advanced learners who are trying to write an essay and they come to one word they don't know and they just write in the L1 word and hold it as a place so they can come back and look it up later, that's a whole different level of L1 use. And of course right now in bilingual and multilingual education, the idea of translanguaging, the fact that a human brain has all of those elements, they're always interacting with each other. The research on priming, the research on separation of languages just shows that once you've learned something, you don't abandon it. It's always there. And anyway, there's so in the classroom itself, it really depends on the level that the learners have reached. What again? It's a little bit like when I said when some teachers see you can do language-focused learning, they all say, "Oh, great! I'll go back to my grammar book." So then I say, "Oh, you need to use L1. Oh, great! I'll go back to my class and I'll speak English or Spanish or whatever the mother tongue of the kids is." I mean, I think most of you would be aware that in much of the world, including the U.S. of A., foreign languages are taught in the mother tongue of the students. I mean, it's a French class, but most of the things are said in English. I cannot tell you how many classes I've been in, even at university level. I'm appalled and astonished. So I'm not by any means suggesting that you teach a second language in a first language. It's crazy. But to pretend that the first language isn't there is equally crazy. It's a tool. It's a resource. A resource. That's a better word.
All right, well, I think we can wrap this up here. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed being here, and I've learned a great deal. Thank you.